key problem that led to Terra's demise was that the reserves seemed to be over-collateralized, but they weren't. So let's see why. Now, there's no shred of doubt that the stunning downfall of the Terra ecosystem in mid-May wounded the cryptocurrency market. Though there were some bold critics who recognized that Terra USD was on a knife's edge, I believe it's safe to say that people just didn't anticipate Terra to fall so quickly, so violently, and so irreversibly. And I made this video while the Terra community votes on a plan to relaunch Terra 2.0, a strategy to save the Layer 1 ecosystem without the UST stablecoin. The old Terra, now known as Terra Classic, is no longer alive. An ill-fated attempt to backstop UST holders resulted in the printing of billions of Luna tokens, undermining their value and eventually compromising the network's stability. The total loss of $50 billion in value appears to have convinced some people once and for all that algorithmic stablecoins cannot function. However, I believe it's critical to have a more nuanced view of why the original Luna failed and how others might benefit from its mistakes. The phrase stablecoin conjures up images of US dollar-pegged currencies that strive to retain a $1 value. But keep in mind that this is largely a question of convenience. The same methods that support today's USD stablecoins may be used to generate coins tied to the euro, gold, or even Bitcoin, maybe Nasdaq futures or a single company such as Tesla. It's also worth noting that stablecoins aren't necessarily a brand new cryptocurrency concept. Today's stablecoin designs are either closely connected to how money operates under a gold standard. For instance, Maker's DAI is a claim to physical collateral, much as early banknotes were claims to a gold vault, or they're reproductions of pegged currencies, such as the Hong Kong dollar. And you know, the Hong Kong dollar is actually an intriguing example in all of this, because it's your typical algorithmic stablecoin, right? It is tied to the US dollar, but not at a 1-to-1 ratio, and the Hong Kong central bank utilizes its huge reserves to keep the Hong Kong dollar's price within a well-defined range by trading it on the market. According to some of the most recent audits, Hong Kong reserves total $463 billion, and this is 6 times the value in immediate circulation, and over half of its M3, the widest definition of money that includes non-immediately liquid assets like locked bank deposits, for instance. But the sole reason that the Hong Kong dollar is not an algorithmic stablecoin is that market operations are conducted by a central bank. In decentralized finance, the central bank is replaced with an algorithm. In general, equating Terra with the algorithmic stablecoin area fails to explain why Terra crashed so dramatically. It's critical to understand how vulnerable the Terra protocol design actually was. In a word, UST was collateralized by Luna, the Terra blockchain's gas token. Because Terra had a pretty good DeFi non-fungible token ecosystem, the Luna token had some intrinsic worth there, which helped to enhance the initial supply of UST. In theory, the process functions similarly to the Hong Kong dollar. If UST sold above $1, consumers may buy some Luna and burn it for its UST worth. The system crucially assumed the UST was worth $1. Thus, the Luna burner may simply sell the UST on the market for, say, $1.01 and profit. They may then reinvest the gains in Luna, burn it again, and repeat the process. And you know, this way, the peg would eventually be repaired. Now, if UST fell below $1, the reverse process aided in its protection. Arbitrageurs would acquire the cheap UST, redeem it for Luna at a 1-to-1 ratio, and then resell the tokens on the market for a profit. In typical situations, this technique does an excellent job of retaining the peg in place. One difficulty with DAI, for instance, is that its underlying collateral cannot be arbitraged directly. Indeed, arbitrageurs must just hope that the peg stabilizes in order to profit, which is why DAI is so reliant on USD coin right now. However, I also need to emphasize Terra's extraordinary reflexivity. Demand for UST causes it to rise above the peg, resulting in demand for Luna, and as a result, an increase in price. Anchor, Terra's lending protocol that promised UST stakers a 20% API, formed the foundation of this system. But where did that API of 20% actually originate from? Well, extra UST generated by Terraform Labs' Luna reserves. A greater Luna price meant that they could manufacture more UST for Anchor yield, raising UST demand and therefore Luna's price, allowing them to mint even more UST. UST and Luna were caught in a cycle of reflexive demand that had all the hallmarks of a Ponzi scheme. What's even worse is that there was no limit on how much UST may be issued as a proportion of the lunar market value. It was entirely driven by reflexivity. And this meant that before the crisis, $30 billion in Lunar's market capitalization was backed by $20 billion in UST's market capitalization. According to Kevin Zhou, founder of Galois Capital and also a well-known opponent of Luna and UST before their collapse, each dollar invested in a risky asset increases its market capitalization by 8 or more times. This meant the UST was grossly under-collateralized. It's clear that multiple variables contributed to the collapse, thus it's hard to pinpoint the exact cause. Anchor reserves were obviously diminishing, with only a couple of months as yield left, and therefore reductions in production were actually discussed. Most huge funds expected a severe fall and/or lengthy bear market. Some conspiracy theories accuse the Citadel or the US government of shorting UST with billions and precipitating the bank panic. And if it's not the US government, it's someone who wants to be the next George Soros, and this guy actually shorted the British pound on Black Wednesday. This is when the pound lost 20% of its value in 2 months. Not as dramatically as Terra, of course. If your system can't handle organized, well-funded attacks, it was probably never that good in the first place. Terraform Labs collected 80,000 Bitcoin to backstop the peg. At the time, it was valued at $2.4 billion. But this was not enough to redeem all UST holders. UST fell below 64 cents on May the 9th and the 10th before rebounding. It's bad, but not fatal. But why UST never recovered is vastly overlooked. Luna's redemption mechanism was set at $300 million per day to prevent a UST bank run from eroding its value. Luna fell from 64 to 30, losing 15 billion in market worth. With Do Kwon and TFL quiet for the next 2 hours, Luna's price continued to fall, reaching single-digit lows. When Luna's market valuation fell to $2 billion, management raised the redemption maximum to $1.2 billion, and the rest is history. This hurried decision led to hyperinflation and ultimately the shutdown of the entire Terra blockchain. Look, TradFi success stories such as the Hong Kong dollar should help explain this, but Terra wasn't over-collateralized. Before the crisis, true collateralization was $3.6 billion, Bitcoin reserves plus the curve liquidity and a couple of days worth of Luna redemptions. When your collateral is variable, even 100% isn't enough. A suitable collateral ratio is 400% to 800%, which accounts for value compression, right? And also, smart contracts should actually prevent the minting of additional currencies if the collateralization isn't ideal. Reserves should be automated. Under Terra, Bitcoin should have been placed in an automated stabilization module instead of opaque market makers. But obviously there wasn't enough time to construct the system. Algorithmic stablecoins can exist with secure collateralization, diversity, and a clear use case. I think it's time for a new design of algorithmic stablecoins. By the way, much of what I recommend here is contained in the DJED white paper that was released a year ago for an over-collateralized algorithmic stablecoin, and nothing has really changed since then. The Terra collapse was unfortunate, but predictable, given just how under-collateralized it was. But anyway, thanks for joining us today. And if you liked the video, make sure to subscribe as we post news every single day of the week. And I will see you tomorrow.